My apologies. We turn again then to William Gurnall and this section, which we're coming tonight to the final and fairly short section, final section of this part of it, why Christians must be ready for trials. Now, we've seen already over previous weeks that we've seen 5 reasons. First of all, Christ commands this frame of spirit. I'm not going to go into the details of any of them just now. Secondly, Christ deserves this frame of spirit. Thirdly, this frame of spirit evidences a heart full of grace. Fourthly, a ready frame of spirit makes the person free. Fifthly, last time we saw that readiness to suffer prepares the Christian for service. The 6th reason, which we come to tonight, is this: readiness to suffer actually gives true enjoyment of life. Readiness to suffer actually gives true enjoyment of life. Now, Gurnall comes at this from the angle that it is impossible for a person to savor life unless he is prepared to lose it. Now, that sounds like a paradox if ever there was one. But he takes us to 2 considerations which help unfold and unlock the paradox for us. He speaks, first of all, about absence of fear, and then he speaks, secondly, about assurance of God's care. So we'll deal, first of all, with absence of fear. Where fear is, there is always torment, of course. And all who let this vulture, as he puts it, continuously feed on them will be spiritually lean. Nothing destroys a man's joy like the fear of losing what he already holds. And because of this insecurity, a person can become their own worst enemies. A murderer can kill only once, but by meditating on his miseries, a man can kill himself 1,000 times over. By meditating on our miseries, we can kill ourselves 1,000 times over. As often as the fear of death and the troubles of life steal into our minds. But when the Christian wears this piece of armour called the gospel of peace, the soul is prepared for both danger and ultimately even for death. And he sits, says Gurnall, at the feast which God in providence has now given him, and he does so able to enjoy it without fear of a messenger of bad news knocking at the door. Now, you can see how this works out in people's lives. People can become so occupied and preoccupied with fears and uncertainties that they are brought down and they become miserable. But the gospel of God's peace and all that is entailed in it should go some way to guard the Christian against that. Indeed, the Christian can even talk about his dying hour and not spoil, says Gurnall, a crumb of his joy, as worldly men assume it must do. To them, the mere mention of death is like the wet cloth, says Gurnall, that Hazael slapped on the king's face. The very shock of the subject scatters every pleasant thought which may have dominated the conversation only minutes before. But on the other hand, the saint who is prepared for whatever may come by God's grace never tastes more sweetness in the comforts of life than actually when he dips into these considerations, meditation of death and eternity. It upsets the worldly man because they know they're not ready. But that same subject actually consoles the believer because they know what they have in Christ. He's got an illustration here, it's typical of him. the thought of death and eternity causes him no more grief than it does to have the first serving of food taken away to make room for the main course. David, for example, was so little tied to this world that he could declare, I will fear no evil, even in the valley of the shadow of death. Psalm 23, verse 4. And what about Peter? Did he know the secret of peace or not? Well, we read there in Acts 12 about Peter. He slept calmly between two soldiers in a prison on the night before Herod would have brought him forth to his execution. And while these are certainly not the usual conditions for rest, he was so sound asleep that the angel had to strike him on the side to wake him up, you remember. I seriously question, says Gurnall, whether Herod himself slept as well that night as Peter did. No doubt this preparation of the gospel of peace brought Peter to such rest. Because he was ready to die, he was able to sleep. Why should he worry when the very worst thing death could do was usher him into the eternal rest in the arms of his Lord? The fear of death, the absence of fear rather, and then the assurance of God's care. The more willing a saint is to suffer from God or for him, the more highly Gurnall maintains the Lord delights to take care of him. A good soldier, he thinks, a good general, he thinks, is most concerned about the soldier who least values his own life. And so, in a sense, the less a Christian values himself and his interests for Christ's sake, the more careful God is to keep him either from suffering or to keep him in it when it comes. Christ had both blessings in mind when he promised, whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it, Matthew 16:25. He then turns to Abraham, ready to offer up Isaac. So the Lord then steps in. But even if the Lord allows the enemy to strike down his saints to death, he shows his tender care even then. The Father gathers up their blood, declares to the hopeless, cruel world who spilt it that precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. So we see that by surrendering ourselves up to God's will, we engage him to take care of us no matter what happens. How much more comfortable can life be than to have our heaviest fear taken off our shoulders and rolled, as Gurnall says, upon the Father? The poor widow never prospered more richly than when the prophet cared for her by requiring that she give up all the food that she had. 1 Kings 17. When a person is finally brought to the foot of God and can earnestly surrender, Lord, here I am, ready to give you all that I am and all I have, then the Lord will oblige himself to care for that soul. Well, to conclude, genuine readiness to suffer thins out the number of true Christians from the ranks of professing believers. It eliminates those whose walk goes no further than a cheap profession. Almost anyone is willing to walk through heaven's door if he hasn't got to risk his pride or in public or hazard his everyday interests by any inconvenience or opposition. But they shall not be able to enter in because their hearts are not willing to strive even unto blood. If we take the standard to be striving, not merely seeking, and he's thinking here of Luke 13:24, I think, then the number of Christian soldiers will shrink like Gideon's army to a little troop. In fact, there are several kinds of Christians, called that in a very broad sense, of course, who have never put on this gospel shoe and are sure to falter along the way. Well, you say, who are they? What are they like? Well, that's the next section. And there we leave our studies this evening and trust the Lord to follow it with his blessing.